Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Income inequality and the equality of opportunity are two of the most controversial and enduring questions for our economy. Is it true that the top 1% capture all of the benefits of our economic system at the expense of the rest of us? Is inequality becoming worse, and has economic mobility disappeared? And is inequality of income even the most important question for us to be talking about? Or rather, is equality of opportunity more important? Joining me today on EconVersations to discuss these questions are my colleague from the Johnson Center, Dr. Dan Smith, the Associate Director of the Johnson Center, and Paul Lichlyter, a Troy University economics major who worked on inequality as part of a fellowship he had over this last summer with the Acton Institute. Dan, welcome back to the show, and Paul, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Paul, I want to start with you and just to ask you first off, tell us a little bit about this fellowship that you had with the Acton Institute, and I think it was through the Koch Foundation, or the Koch Institute as well, right?
Right, the fellowship program was through the Koch Institute. I spent a week in Washington, D.C. For a training seminar. Then I went over to Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I worked over the summer at the Acton Institute as a public policy intern.
And one of the topics that you did some research on and then wrote about was income inequality, right?
Right. The Acton Institute focuses on morality in society, and so there was a lot of discussion at the Institute about the Pope and his visit to the United States recently. Mm-hmm. And in that, I noticed that he had made a lot of comments recently about income inequality and how we need to solve that problem, which started the research, which started me researching income inequality, and that's where I really got started on that topic.
Now, we've used the term, I think, both income and wealth already here, and when we talk about inequality, sometimes people refer to income inequality, some people refer to wealth inequality. Are those two terms the same thing, or are they used interchangeably?
They're often used interchangeably, but they're actually two distinct concepts. Income inequality is a flow concept, and it's referring to the annual income that someone receives in a year, dividend, interest, salary, everything like that. That's actually a flow of income. Whereas wealth is going to be more of a stock concept, total investments, real estate, and everything like that, but not the income that is generated off of it. So it's two different concepts, and where people can make mistakes moving back between each other when they're looking at statistical data.
Now, income or wealth inequality and the extent that we have inequality is really important because so many policy issues seem to come back to this whole question, and also the ethical questions about whether a given distribution of income or wealth in our society can be justified or not, right?
Yes. A lot of the policy issues today are discussing income inequality, especially you'll see in this election, Bernie Sanders. I know that's one of his main points of interest is income inequality and how we can solve it, because from his perspective, it is a problem that needs to be solved. Well,
I guess if we want to start with the question here, our first question to start with would be to ask the question, how much income inequality is there in the United States, and is it actually getting worse like some people allege? So let's start here with this. Is income equally distributed, or just how unequally is income distributed?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways you can measure this and look at it. I did want to mention, since the previous slide you showed actually showed RIP, the middle class, and one thing I did want to mention about that is that depending on how you look at the data, you can actually look at the data and say, wow, the middle class is disappearing. Mm-hmm. And that is if you set the middle income bracket between 5,000, let's say 5,000 and 30,000. Over time, people have moved out of that group, but they've moved into a higher income bracket, over 75,000. So, mm-hmm. Well, the income, so you can look at that data and say, well, the middle class is disappearing, this is something bad. In actuality, where people are moving up to, the whole distribution is moving up to higher income level brackets, so that you're actually seeing these people move into higher income brackets. So we have middle class, they're just earning more than mm-hmm. middle class was 25, 50 years ago. So it's really important to look at the data in a correct fashion. This is showing the distribution of personal income over various income groups. And what you see is you're seeing a pretty normal bell-shaped distribution here, where you're seeing where there's a lot of people earning a lot of people within those middle income brackets, so they have not disappeared over time. In fact, their incomes have, I would argue, increased over time. But everyone's income has increased over this time, the wealthy, the middle class, but particularly the poor in society as well.
Now, as you mentioned, we also have the idea of wealth distribution as well. And so and wealth represents, as you mentioned, the stock or accumulated amount of assets that people have. And in this case, I think I want to mention here that this diagram is set up a little bit differently, that whereas before we were showing the number of people falling in different income categories, this is set up with what are known as wealth quintiles, where people are already ranked by their wealth, and so therefore necessarily the people with the highest income or highest wealth are going to have a lot more than the lower quintiles here. So I think the U.S. median that is shown there is around $68,000 in terms of net wealth, and this is. I mean, I guess when you look at this, you can definitely see that there's some skewness or unequalness here, right?
That's the key distinction between the two graphs. Is one does measure people and percentage of people in different brackets, and the other measures national income or wealth in this case. And whenever you measure national income, you're going to see it's skewed heavily to the higher income earners. And you were mentioning over time whether this increases. The income is the gap is increasing. I believe that over the past 40 years, the highest quintile has actually increased their income by close to 70%. But you'll also see an increase in the lower quintiles as well, just not to the same extent as in the higher quintile.
So there has been some change over time, right?
Right, definitely.
But as we start to get into this, I mean, there are a number of limitations or weaknesses with most of this data that we have here on income and wealth is from the Census Bureau. And as economists have recognized for many years, there are some weaknesses with some of this data. And for instance, when you're looking at different quintiles of households ranked on income or wealth, I mean, there's not the same number of people in each of those groups, right?
Yeah, so if you break it up by quintiles, you'll see that the top income brackets, the top 20%, have far more earners per household, far more people per household, and they're more likely to work full-time rather than part-time or not at all. And that's compared to the bottom 20%. So they're not just comparing apples to apples here, you're comparing different types of households. Households in the top income bracket are more likely to be in their prime earning years. Households in the bottom 20% are more likely to be younger or older, retirees. So you're not making it doesn't make a very good comparison just looking at it by quintile without adjusting for all these demographic factors.
And there are a number of other weaknesses or limitations to census data. For instance, it reports reported income, but it doesn't take into account, say, employer-paid benefits. And that's actually a pretty important omission here, especially in terms of judging the middle class versus others, right?
Yeah, in fact, one of the biggest areas of employee pay compensation has been benefits. Employees prefer to get paid in more time off, more daycare at their work, health care, dental care, vision care. All of these additional fringe benefits aren't included in the traditional data that we look at when we're looking at incomes. So when you leave that out, you're leaving out about 30% of the increase in income that the average worker has experienced over this time frame. So if you include that in there, you're going to see a lot more growth in average wage and compensation or overall compensation than you would if you just look at the actual wages they've been receiving.
Another issue that arises is that when we look at these income or wealth quintiles taken in any given year, and then people make some statements about how the amount of money being earned by the top 10% or the top 5% or the top 20% of earners is larger now than it was 20 years ago. Although we're ranking households by income or wealth, it's not actually the same households in those quintiles every year, right?
Right. There's a lot of social mobility, or income mobility more specifically. You'll see people in the top bracket drop out of the top bracket constantly. You'll see people from lower brackets move up constantly. I forget the exact percentages, but it's huge, the amount of social mobility that you'll see in the U.S.
And it would certainly imagine that, especially on the standpoint of income, if you've been working to get a business started for a number of years, when that business finally takes off, you hit it big, you earn a lot of money. So it looks in that year like you've won the lottery. You've got this very large income for a couple of years when the business really starts to take off. But it doesn't tell the whole story if you just look at the year and the amount of success you have in that year. Right?
I know from 1999 to 2007. Half the people who earned $1 million only did so for 1 year. It was just a standalone event, like you were talking. The business takes off, they make a lot of money, but then over time it starts to even out, like you were saying.
And then I guess another issue we get into here is that there can certainly be some reasons for some of these differences in income and wealth, because we've already hinted at one with success of businesses. But if another difference we see is if we simply look at the urban-rural difference in income as well, right? There's a well-established and long-standing pattern of differences in earnings between city dwellers and country folk, right?
Yeah, in fact, if you adjust for this type of data, you can see a better estimates. You can better estimate how much people are actually making, because you're seeing people in the inner cities earn a lot more than people out in the countryside, in the rural areas. And as people move towards, you're going to have some people that still stay in the rural areas. As people gravitate towards those cities and start earning more, their incomes are going to go up, and it's going to look like it's going up much higher than the people in the rural countryside, but you can get a lot more out of, let's say, $30,000 in Troy, Alabama than you can in New York City. It's going to go a lot further in Troy, Alabama due to the cost of living calculations. And I also want to add on, there's something economists call compensating differentials. And what you've also seen over the same time period is people have taken jobs more in the South, where the weather is nicer. People are willing to pay and even take a small, or more appropriately, take a small pay cut in order to take a job down south rather than work up in the north, where it's much more frigid and cold. And also, there's compensating differentials in different employments because people have taken jobs that have increasingly fit their personal interest more. So as the number of jobs have expanded, people can say, I like accounting, I like economics, I like eating hot dogs for a living, or I like working with dolphins, I like singing. As occupational choices increase, people have been able to better fit their occupational choice to their own personal preferences, and that gives them a lot more joy out of that occupation. But they're willing to pay for that and take somewhat lower pay in order to work an occupation that they really truly love. So when we look at income growth over this period, not only are incomes rising, but people are also living in better locations that they prefer, and they're taking jobs that they prefer. And then even on top of that, when you look at occupational fatalities, the safety in these jobs has increased drastically over this time as well. And that can add on that's an additional benefit that these employees are receiving that isn't included in traditional wage data.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing, because certainly when you look at, I remember going on a tour of a Ford motor plant when I was young, and it was loud, it was noisy, it was also dangerous. Obviously, they sheltered us as visiting school children from getting into any danger ourselves. But a lot of jobs, in the days gone by, were quite nasty, and people were getting paid for taking that. And then if you have nicer jobs now, you lose that compensation on there, and I think that's another really important point. Now, another important, one of the most important factors in terms of determining people's income is education, right? Paul?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think that depending on your level of education, it certainly determines how much you're going to earn. You can just look at the graph and see that with a professional degree, you're making substantially more than with a lower level of education.
But if somebody's going to take time from their lives to go to school for, say 4 years, as you're currently doing, or maybe longer if somebody's going to end up going to graduate school like Dan and I did, that in itself, as you've explained, is going to have an effect on income distribution, right? Could you explain that to us?
Right, absolutely. If you're willing to sacrifice the time and the resources to go to school for that period of time, then it leads to more long-term income growth. But yeah, in the short term, you're going to be making a lot less. So you'll see some of those categories where you have people who are making less, people who are in the lower quintiles. Oftentimes, that's college students, people who are going to be making a lot more money in the future. So that's another reason those quintiles don't tell the entire story, because oftentimes, because they're just a static picture, they don't show the whole story. Like, those people might be sacrificing current income so that they can make more in the long term.
And I guess that would probably also be true with wealth. And so a lot of people, students like yourself, if you're taking out loans to help pay for schooling right now, you probably have negative net worth, and that's, you're down to the lower income, I guess the lowest wealth quintile there. Now, this also gets into an important question of whether differentials in income or wealth might be earned in some way, because there's clearly, when you look at schooling, if somebody goes to school and studies hard, and then they end up getting a college degree or an advanced degree, and they compensate for that, have they earned that money?
Right. When you do get a degree, you do work for that degree, and it is earned, and the compensation as a result of that degree is earned. And a lot of the times that the higher income bracket is a result of the time, the effort that was put into college in order to get that degree. Often the response to that will be that the opportunities for everyone to get that degree is not equal. And that's one of the key responses, is that we want equality of opportunity. And there's this huge divide between equality of opportunity and equality of income, and that's where the argument really lies. Is there equality of opportunity, and is that lack of equality leading to a lack of income inequality?
So then it sounds like what the more, perhaps the more important question to focus on is not necessarily the distribution of income, but whether people have, in some sense, done something, contributed some value to society to help allow them to earn income, right?
Exactly. I mean, income is just the consequence of your labor, of your work. It's the reward that you receive for working, and I think a lot of the times people forget that. They'll look at national income, they'll look at national wealth, look at everything from an aggregate, and they'll forget that it's the work of individuals and the time that they've put in. And so they'll say, well, we need equality of income. We need to take this national income, we need to split it up between 300 million people, instead of thinking, well, each person put time, put effort to make the amount that they made, and that amount is a result of their effort.
And so if people's talents and ability to contribute aren't going to be equal, there's no reason to expect that everybody's going to get rewarded equally, right?
Right. Everybody has different talents. Everybody makes different choices. I can choose to make less money if I do something that I might enjoy more than if I chose to be an investment banker and make a lot more. Everybody makes choices regarding how much they want to make, and everybody has different abilities, like you said.
So even as long as some of our large income earners, if they're making a contribution, that's maybe more important than fixating on the amount of money they happen to be earning.
Absolutely. Both of those people contributed substantially to the society. Some would say one more so than others, but it was the contribution that led to the wealth. It wasn't just somebody just handed them a blank check for doing nothing. Now,
are there some ways in which people might be prevented from earning income that would be problematic, like say if there was discrimination, and how should we think about that?
Oh, absolutely. I think that when people talk about income inequality, the issue should actually be equality, making equality of opportunity. Make sure there's no racial discrimination going on. Make sure there's no discrimination, period, between genders or anything whatsoever. When people talk about income inequality, too often they look at the amount and say the amount should be the same across the board. But like you said, everyone has different skills, different abilities. So the amount isn't going to be the same. There's no way that the person taking out the trash should get paid as much as the CEO in a company. There's no way that those should be equal amounts because they're different abilities. But two CEOs or two maintenance workers who have the same skill set should be paid the same given their ability. There shouldn't be a difference based on skin color or gender or anything like that.
Well, we've gotten to this question of equality of opportunity, and one way economists try to measure that is what we call economic mobility. Whether somebody I guess as the old saying would be, are they free to rise to whatever the level of their talents? Like, say, I think LeBron and Steve Jobs both did. They both started at very humble beginnings. Now, some people claim that economic mobility has disappeared in our economy, and that although maybe at one point in time in the past we used to be this opportunity society, economic mobility is gone away. What do the statistics show on this?
Yeah, so this is really important. I think the primary question, so many people focus on the dispersion of income inequality. And as long as all incomes are increasing, I'm far more concerned about people's ability, if they're born in the bottom rung of society, to move up if they desire. And when we look at that evidence, and usually these studies are done in 8, 9, 10-year periods, and they'll look at everyone, let's say, in the bottom 20% in 1980, and then see by 1990 how many of those same people are still in that bottom 20% bracket. And what they find is that it's hovering around 50% each year. That 50% of those in the bottom 20% are able to move up to higher income brackets over a 10-year period. And 50% of those people in the top, or roughly around 50% of those people in the top 20% move down over that same period. So there's a high degree of mobility, and largely what this is over people's lifespans. As people go to college, they learn no income, they go into debt actually, and then as they enter the workforce, they start earning income, and over their life they earn more and more and more. They move up the income brackets, and then eventually they will retire. And at that point, they earn no income because they're living off of accumulated life savings. So they're moving up that income bracket and then down that income bracket. Mark Rank in the Wall Street Journal actually found out that about 80% of Americans will at one point in their lifetime find themselves in the top 20%. So it's really important to examine that ability to move up and down in society and focus on maximizing people's ability to do that rather than on trying to equalize incomes. Because if we equalize incomes, you're gonna take away that incentive for these people born with rare and unique talents to use them and to work hard to serve others. When people like Steve Jobs earn that money, it's saying that they've created that value to society. As Paul said, they're not taking it away from society. In fact, they're using their unique skill sets to serve society, and that's how they earn that income. And as soon as they quit doing that, then all of their wealth, accumulated wealth, is going to disappear because it's all tied up in stock values. And unless they're serving customer ends, that wealth is going to dissipate.
I guess one response some people might have is say, like, well, look, if people like Steve Jobs or LeBron James are earning more money, mustn't that money have to be coming from somebody else? I mean, it does. If these guys are getting a larger share of the pie, doesn't that mean there's less for somebody else? How do you respond to something like that?
Yeah, so the share of wealth in society is not fixed. And we can see that with the innovations that we've experienced, even in the last 10, 15, 20 years. Cell phones, invented in 1985, that cost $5,000, and all they did was make phone calls. Well, people invested in that technology because there's a demand for it. Only the wealthy could afford it. And within 15 years, it's now 15, 20 years, everyone can afford a cell phone. They do far more than just make phone calls. They're far more effective and efficient and widely available to everyone. That's entirely new wealth, a new form of compensation that did not exist previously. Because the important thing to think about when we're thinking about income is that it's what we can buy, the goods and services. That's the real wealth. Wealth is not just the accumulated dollars that we earn in each year, or the amount of money that we have in the bank account. It's what we can buy with those, what we can buy with those dollars, the goods and services. And as we create new things, as entrepreneurs come up with new ideas, we expand wealth because there's more things that we can buy. There's more goods that we can consume. Things that we didn't even think of knew existed previously that now exist today.
Now, as we turn to the question of whether the government should take actions to try to, maybe try to make the distribution of income more equal in our economy, one thing we should probably note is that there are some actions that government take that actively restricts the ability of some people to earn income, and that could be very significant here, right?
Yeah, so there's a couple things that I think prevent that ability to move up, the mobility in society. And one of those is occupational licensing. Another one is minimum wage. A third one could possibly be poor K through 12 public education. But let's focus first on occupational licensing. There's been a lot of studies from a lot of different scholars. In fact, the White House recently, Obama's White House recently just came out with a report on occupational licensing. And the consensus is pretty clear. Occupational licensing, which sets a group of or set of requirements necessary to enter occupation, is actually used by people within that occupation to keep people from entering it, thus raising the salaries of the people within that occupation, but preventing occupational mobility and economic mobility to people that aren't in that profession. And they do this through different requirements like that for interior designers. Interior designing is a pretty straightforward, easy profession. Not necessarily easy, but it doesn't pose any safety risk for consumers. Mm-hmm. Yet, a lot of states have implemented interior design licensing, requiring that you go to school for a certain number of years, that you take these tests, that you serve as an intern for so long, and it really raises the cost to enter that profession, denying that economic mobility for especially minority groups.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like those are the types of policies we really need to eliminate, just to, again, so people can take advantage of their specialized or unique talents where they happen to be. I guess when we look at this larger question, we've already touched on it some, but I think it's worth coming back to raise the question of if we did want to try to redistribute wealth, and if people are earning income or wealth based as a reward for the good things they're doing to help contribute to society, it's going to necessarily be costly if we try to tax that wealth away from them, right?
Right, absolutely. Anytime you try to tax the wealth, you run into unintended consequences, I think, because the amount of money that somebody has to spend is less at that point, so they're not able to purchase the goods that they would otherwise, and the person who would receive that money is then hurt. You see less income for some individuals because you take the income from other individuals through taxes. And
I guess another thing to keep in mind, so not only might there be a large cost to trying to redistribute income, but I think you mentioned this earlier, Paul, that incomes have been going up across the spectrum, and even if like the incomes for the top quintile has been rising faster than incomes in other quintiles, they've been going up as well, right?
They've all been going up, right? And I think that's the key. That's the thing you need to focus on, is that all incomes are increasing because the standard of living is increasing as well. And when that happens, you have a wealthier society across the board. And too many people focus on that gap and how the gap is increasing, but they ignore the fact that the standard of living and just the income itself for people in the lower quintiles is also increasing.
It seems like you run a danger there of getting into an issue of envy, and envy is not necessarily having to do with anything about whether rewards are earned or not, right?
Yeah, definitely. Everyone wants as much as the next guy, but a lot of the times they don't want to work for it, and there's easier ways than working, because you see welfare programs, you see people arguing for increased taxes for the higher quintile of workers, of income earners, and redistributing that money to people who are making less money. And like you said, all those programs are based on the concept of envy and not wanting to work for the amount of money necessarily that you make. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Well, any last thoughts here? Any last thing we've left off before we wrap up?
Well, I mean, there's always a lot here, and it's a difficult subject, and I hope we can come back on eventually and talk about it in even more detail.
Well, thank you both for joining us. Paul, you enjoyed the conversation, and good luck with your studies. And Dan, again, thanks for coming on the show. Thank you for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.